Our guest of honor today is James McPherson, the George Henry Davis 86 Professor of History, Emeritus at Princeton University. He's published numerous volumes on the Civil War. He's won the prestigious Lincoln Prize, and now, if you've been following in the news, the prestigious Pritzker Prize, a new prize from the Pritzker Military Library in Chicago.
Jim, we're going to go on to our next set of questions, which relate to Chapter 5. I have one question. It's a big question. The Civil War had a major impact abroad. Britain and France, toing and froing, constantly thought about whether they should recognize the Confederacy or offer to mediate. Russia was involved to some extent. And Palmerston was, I think, very, very important. I think you described him as crucial at the crucial time in avoiding a form of British intervention. So maybe you could describe what was going on in the minds of the British and French populations and governments, and how things swung back and forth over time, and why Palmerston and the British government took the attitude that they did.
Well, in Britain, public opinion toward the American Civil War was divided. What we would maybe call liberals in today's sense of the word, or moderates, tended to sympathize with the Union cause because they saw it, as more democratic and therefore compatible with their effort to elevate the middle classes and the working classes. And they also saw it as potentially anti-slavery. Now, as long as the Lincoln administration said that we're fighting only to restore the Union of 1861 and not to abolish slavery, there was not much they could do in terms of saying, well, the North is really anti-slavery. And I think the pressure from British supporters of the Union cause to make it a war against slavery was a factor in Lincoln's decision-making on the question of emancipation. Maybe not the principal factor, but it was a factor. Most of the working class also sympathized with the Union cause. On the other hand, the rising unemployment in 1862 because of the substantial cutoff of cotton imports from the American South by 1862 created a real problem for the working class. Their minds might have sympathized with the North, but their livelihoods depended on cotton from the Confederacy, from the American South. So there was a real tension there. Much of the upper classes in Britain, and even some of the commercial urban middle classes or upper middle classes, the new industrialists, tended to, if not support the Confederacy, which was difficult for a nation that regarded itself as the world's policeman against the slave trade, and a nation that had abolished slavery in its own colonies a generation earlier, nevertheless tended to be sympathetic to the Confederacy, or at least hostile to Americans. And so British public opinion was badly divided, and that made it a difficult political decision for any British administration, any British government. I guess they don't call it the administration in Britain, they call it the government. Yeah. For any British government to take sides in the war, because whichever side they take is going to alienate a large share of their population. But I think Palmerston, as Prime Minister, and as a man who had been in political life for almost 50 years, was a very pragmatic politician. He did not want to get the British involved by taking sides in any international controversy that could jeopardize its own national interests. And so he took a position that the British ought to stay out of this conflict to the extent possible until it became clearer whether the Confederacy was going to establish its independence. There was a kind of catch-22 about the British effort to obtain European recognition in 1862 especially. Southerners wanted that for the moral effect it would have if the British and other nations would follow the British lead, the British and French lead, should exchange ambassadors or ministers, as the Americans called it in those days, and recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. It would have a huge impact on Southern morale, a negative impact on Northern morale. It would constitute a kind of imprimatur that the Confederacy is a separate nation. And the Confederacy hoped for that. They hoped for it as a first step toward actual support from the British, the way the French had supported the Americans in the Revolution after the Battle of Saratoga, which was crucial in America winning its independence and winning that war. The Confederacy developed the same kind of scenario. We'll get recognition by the European nations and we'll get aid by the European nations, and the British need our cotton, so they'll send their navy to break the blockade. And that'll either put them at war with the United States or what the Europeans, the British, wanted to do was to mediate the end of the conflict through their good offices, their diplomatic efforts. But the catch-22 was that the Confederacy wanted this as a help to winning the war, and Palmerston, who determined British policy, and the cabinet, didn't want to offer recognition until the Confederacy clearly had won the war. Mm-hmm. So, and that's the way it came out. We know that if Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland in September 1862 had won another Confederate victory on the scale of the two previous major battles, the 7 Days and then Second Bull Run, that the British cabinet would have joined with the French to offer to mediate an end to this conflict on the basis of Confederate independence. And if the Lincoln administration had refused that offer, which they probably would have done, then the British and the French, probably followed by most other European nations except probably Russia, would have offered diplomatic recognition to the Confederacy. And that, the consequences of that are incalculable. We can't really know. But it clearly would have been a shot in the arm for the Confederacy and would have been a terrible blow to the Lincoln and to the Union cause. It didn't happen because Antietam caused Palmerston and a majority of the British, but not too large a majority of the British cabinet, to back off. The French still wanted to go ahead. They wanted to go ahead as late as 1863, and it was really only Gettysburg that kind of put an end to that. But clearly, this was a vital issue for all of the parties concerned, especially in the year 1862. And at the root of that, I think, were not only the things I've already mentioned, the slavery issue, cotton as a factor, and the unemployment in the textile mills, but also Britain's self-perceived role as the kind of arbiter of world order, the guarantor of world order. This American Civil War was a huge threat to the stability of the international order as it existed in the 1850s and 1860s. It carried all kinds of possibilities for a wider war, a war on the open seas over the issue of the blockade and of the Confederate commerce raiders like the Alabama. Carried the potentiality of a conflict between the northern part of the United States and the British in Canada. It had potentially disruptive consequences, and I think that was at the top of Palmerston's concern. The potential for a wider war. And Palmerston also had a little saying that I've been trying to remember, that encapsulated his argument about staying out if at all possible. I think it went something like this: "He who in quarrels interposes is likely to get a bloody nose," or something like that. I don't have all of that exactly right, but that was
Right.
that was the aphorism, the little
Right.
saying that he had
Right.
about this, and he very much wanted to avoid that kind of a conflict.
Right. Very interesting. And the threat of I had not quite realized about the threat of war on the high seas, and of course Canada. We had invaded Canada twice already, so that was a serious question. Any questions on the foreign affairs matters, sir? There, if you would go to the microphone.
Quickly, I noticed this in your book on Antietam, and I've had assigned that to my students. You say that all of Europe but Russia would have joined with the Confederacy, and I was wondering why not Russia? Did it have to do with the emancipation of the serfs, or?
No. Well, I think what I said there is that most European nations would likely follow the British and French lead, except possibly Russia. You know, this kind of strange bedfellows thing. The most autocratic nation in all of Europe was Russia, and yet probably the most strong pro-union government in all of Europe was Russia. And I think that had more to do with the consequences or the legacy of the Crimean War from 1854 to 1856, which of course pitted the British and French on one side as allies of Turkey against the Russians. And so there was a great deal of hostility between, still fears of tensions between Russia on one side and the British and the French on the other. And that meant that Russians were not likely to sympathize with any policy of recognizing or supporting the Confederacy that the British and French pioneered, took the lead in. So Tsar Alexander was actually quite pro-union during the war, which seems a little bit surprising. It wasn't an ideological question. I think it was entirely a question of pragmatism. The Russians saw the United States, a strong United States, as a counterweight to British and French domination of the world, including the high seas.
Bill Quigley from the Governor's Academy in Byfield, Massachusetts. There was also a horrendous civil war that was going on over in China at the same time, the Taiping Rebellion, and led by someone who claimed to be a Christian. And I was just wondering, what awareness was there amongst Americans that this civil war was taking place there? And did the Lincoln administration have any sort of involvement at all with what was going on?
As far as I know, none. I've never encountered or encountered very little comment in American newspapers or correspondence or government documents about what was going on in China, the Taipei Rebellion. It's kind of strange because trade between America and China had been a major factor in the first half of the 19th century. But there seemed to be very little awareness. There was far more awareness of what was going on right south of the border in Mexico, which also was having a civil war during this period, or what was going on in Poland, the Polish rebellion against the Russians in 1863, or other European events. Those things would find their way into American newspapers, but I've rarely run across any reference to what was going on in China. I guess it wasn't on the radar screen for Americans, which is surprising given the amount of trade that had taken place and still was taking place with China. And the missionary issue, yeah, exactly.
Oh, sir.
John Beagle, Western New England College. I had heard that prior to the Civil War, there was a rumor in Washington, D.C., talk about possibly attacking England as a way to unite North and South and potentially stave off a civil war. I've never actually seen any references to that myself. Have you heard anything about this? Is there any truth to that? This notion of somehow attacking England, the old foe, would stir up memories of the Revolution and reunite Northerners and Southerners and prevent.
Yeah, there was talk of that, and in fact, William H. Seward's famous memorandum of April 1st, 1861, proposed that the United States stir up a controversy with either Spain or France or England over their violations of the Monroe Doctrine in Mexico and in what was then called Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic today. Seward had this idea of what he called, this is during the secession winter of 1860-61. First, he had the idea that he would be the premier of the Lincoln administration, that he would be running things, because he was far more experienced. He had expected, of course, to be the Republican nominee for the president. He was, the Secretary of State was, of course, the top level of the cabinet in those days, so he expected to be running things. And he also was very much in favor of what he called voluntary reconstruction. That is, the seceded states had gone out, but we ought to come up with some kind of policy to encourage them to come back voluntarily. And that's how we're going to solve this problem of secession. That didn't seem to be going very well. And there were all these tensions about Fort Sumter. So Seward writes this memorandum in which he says, let's pull the troops out of Fort Sumter, but we'll reinforce Fort Pickens just as a symbol. But more important, let's send strong diplomatic protests to France, Spain, and England about their intervention in Mexico. They had all intervened in Mexico to help collect debts owed to their nationals. And Spain was also sending troops to Santo Domingo. There's disorder there. This is all a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. You know, let's call them on this. And maybe, you know, we might even get a war out of this, and that will reunite North and South. Lincoln put the squabash on that and said, you know, well, nothing to do with this. But that's probably where what you're talking about comes from.
All right, last question, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen. Leo Sakalarian from Neshoba Regional High School. If we assume a different outcome from the Battle of Antietam and there is a British move for intervention, that would take two forms, either a diplomatic push for mediation or beyond that, potential military intervention. Would the British have considered going that far, or was military intervention perhaps further than they ever would have gone?
I don't think that it would have been military intervention in the same way that the French had intervened in the American Revolution. But the next step might have been some kind of effort to protect British merchant ships trading with the Confederacy, which they now would, of course, recognize as an independent nation, and protect ships exporting cotton from the South to the British textile mills. And that might have led to some kind of war on the high seas. And it might have led to retaliation by the United States through invading Canada, which of course would have brought the, so there were many different kind of potentialities here. And I think that's why Palmerston, you know, once you take one step, you may not be able to control what happens in the next 2 or 3 steps. And so maybe it's best not to take that first step at all. That was basically Palmerston's idea, I think.
That, of course, doesn't happen anymore.
Good example of that, yeah. So, you know, I don't think that anybody had a game plan to say, okay, in Britain, let's say, after we recognize the Confederacy, here's what we're going to do next. But any number of different things could have happened. The Confederates had in mind what had happened in the Revolution with France. First, they recognize us. Then we form a treaty of alliance with us. Then they send their navy and some of their troops over here, and they help us win the war. I don't think that the British were going to go that direction the way the French had done in the Revolution. But, you know, anything would have been helpful to, any small step would have been helpful to the Confederacy and might have led to, you know, incalculable consequences.
You know, it seems to me, Jim, that what you're describing, not only in a larger sense, as you say, did that happen when we started defending Da Nang and so forth, and in Iraq. But that is almost exactly what happened in World War I on freedom of the seas, and World War II when we gave them the destroyers
Yep.
so that our commerce could move.
Yep.
All right, let's move on for the last part of the morning session to the question of the match or mismatch between national motives or national aims and national methods. Another problem which we have faced dramatically in the last 50 years on more than one occasion. To what extent, Jim, do you think that for both North and South, national aims and national methods for achieving those aims were at loggerheads, with particular reference, for example, to the disputes, for lack of a better word, between Lincoln and his generals, and the agreement or disagreement between Lee and his generals, Davis and his generals, particularly Lee, but also Joe Johnston, and maybe throw in just a little bit about how you see the match or mismatch of national aims and national methods in other American wars.
Okay, well, that's a kind of a big charge. Let me come at this a little bit obliquely from some discussion of a book I'm working on right now, which is a book about Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. And in that book, I develop a kind of typology of what a president as Commander-in-Chief in wartime, his levels of responsibility and duty and leadership. And this is borrowed from a lot of literature on military strategy and so on. But in wartime, a nation has a set of war aims, or we'll call that policy. What is our objective in this war? What are our goals in this war? That's policy. Then there's national strategy. How do we mobilize the population, the economic resources of the country, the diplomatic resources of the country, the psychological will of the people to carry out these war aims? Then there's military strategy. What military steps and operations are we going to take in order to achieve these war aims? So now I've argued that there needs to be some kind of congruence or compatibility between these three major factors: policy, national strategy, and military strategy. Take the Confederacy in the Civil War. Their war aim was to defend the independence of their nationhood that they had formed when they created the Confederate States of America in February 1861. Now, how do you do that? Well, once the other side, you do that by peace if you can, but they had to make a decision about Fort Sumter, and they attacked Fort Sumter. And that brought on a war, and so your policy in the war has to be to mobilize the resources to win that war. Winning the war means defending what you already have. In the case of the Confederacy, it was a going concern in April 1861 with a government, with a constitution, with an army already, and pretty much in complete control of the the 7 states, and then of course when Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas seceded, the 11 states, pretty much in control of all of those 11 states, the territory of those 11 states, with a minor exception of the Fort Monroe at the Virginia Peninsula in May 1861. So what is the military strategy to defend what you already have? Well, some kind of a defensive strategy. The other side is going to have to invade, so you stand on the defense and repel these invasions. And that was basically Jefferson Davis's military strategy, what's called a kind of a perimeter defense, a cordon defense, defend every part of the border The only problem with that military strategy is that that disperses your forces all around the perimeter. And so there was a great debate within the Confederacy about whether they ought to remain on this kind of static defense, trying to defend everything around the 3,000 or 4,000 miles circumference of the Confederacy. It's a big nation, 750,000 square miles. Do you try to defend every one of those square miles? Or do you concentrate into 3 or 4 strong armies, defeat the enemy's major armies, take the war to the enemy, even invade enemy territory if necessary to defeat their armies or to demoralize their people? And so there was this tension within Confederate strategy between a kind of strictly defensive policy, or what came to be called, I think Davis himself, Jefferson Davis himself, called it a defensive offensive. And historians have called it the offensive defensive. Basically what it means is, I mean, to use a football analogy, the best defense is a good offense. If you spend your whole game defending your own goal line, you're going to lose sooner or later. But if you've got a good offense, you can keep the ball in the other guy's end of the field. That became the preeminent strategy of Robert E. Lee, as long as he had the capability to carry it out. So you can see that there are real potential tensions here. Lee stood for striking the enemy wherever and whenever you can find him, and seizing the initiative and holding the initiative, even to invading enemy territories in order to defeat his army on his own territory and to demoralize, to force the enemy to sue for peace. The opposite of that, I guess, was Joseph Johnston, who followed, especially in the Georgia campaign of 1864, but even in 1862, when he was in charge in Virginia in the first months of 1862, yield the enemy a lot of territory, like the Russians in 1812 when Napoleon invaded Russia. Wait till he's overextended, and then give him a bloody nose. Fight, draw him into your territory, weaken him by extension of his supply lines, weaken him by attacking him around the edge. And then at the opportune moment, maybe you'll be able to defeat his army, penetrate it deeply, and force him to retreat. In recent years, a couple of very prominent military historians of the Confederacy, Emory Thomas and Stephen Woodworth, have written studies of Lee and his relationship with Davis, who see a real tension between Davis and Lee on this. That Davis was more inclined to remain on the defensive and to conserve Confederate manpower. That Lee was prodigal in expending Confederate blood, and even when he was successful in his counteroffensive in the 7 days that cost 20,000 Confederate casualties, and his counteroffensive that struck the Union in Second Manassas or Bull Run, and then invaded the Maryland and led to Antietam, and the combined casualties of the Confederates in those two battles was over 20,000. And then his invasion of Pennsylvania in 1863, which led to almost 30,000 Confederate casualties, prodigal of Confederate blood, even though many of these battles were successful. These campaigns were successful. They see that a tension between Davis and Lee on this. The irony of that is that Davis and Lee, I think, got along very well together. I personally think that Davis was more in favor of Lee's offensive-defensive kind of strategy, and that the greatest tensions within the Confederate military establishment were between Davis and Johnston. They hated each other. And Davis finally fired Johnston because of the way in which his Fabian strategy, or you might call it his Russian strategy of letting the enemy penetrate deeply into your own territory, it seemed to have failed and to undermine Confederate morale. But nevertheless, throughout the war, there really was a tension in Confederate strategy between the purely defensive and what Lee called, or what several historians at least have called, the offensive defensive. On the northern side, there was often tension between policy and national strategy and military strategy because of the expanding war aims of the northern side. The initial policy or war aim of the Lincoln administration was to restore the Union as it had existed before the creation of the Confederacy. Well, how do you do that? Do you do that by defeating Confederate armies but conciliating the civilian population? Do you do that by leaving slavery alone? Do you do that by protecting civilian property, including slaves? Do you do that by just recapturing the forts that the Confederacy has seized, like Fort Sumter? And then, you know, appealing to the kind of latent unionism of the Southern people? Well, this was a great debate within Union strategy, and at first the Union pursued what were really a kind of a limited war strategy. We'll defeat their armies, and then maybe they'll come back into the Union. That didn't work. We'll invade their territory and gain control of some of these 750,000 square miles of Confederate territory. And that actually happened in the early months of 1862. Capture of New Orleans, the capture of Nashville, the capture of Memphis, the capture of most of Tennessee, much of the lower Mississippi Valley, the gaining control of the river networks in the Western Confederacy, gaining control of the coastal areas of the South Atlantic coast of the Confederacy. But the war goes on. The policy of conciliating Southern civilians while trying to defeat Confederate armies doesn't seem to be working. Southern civilians don't want to be conciliated. And so gradually, the Lincoln administration's national strategy and military strategy grow more thoroughgoing, more radical, more destructive. Lincoln at first wants to conciliate the border state slaveholding Unionists. So he doesn't want to touch slavery. And when General Fremont issues a military order emancipating the slaves of Confederate supporters in Missouri, Lincoln squashes it. When General Hunter in May 1862 issues a military order declaring the slaves in the South Atlantic states free, Lincoln squashes that. But finally, Lincoln decides that slavery is not only at the root of this war, but slavery is the basis of the Confederate economy. Slave labor provides the logistical infrastructure of Confederate armies. Conciliating Southern civilians hasn't seemed to work. Leaving slave property alone doesn't seem to have caused Southern civilians to be sympathetic to the Union. Conquering Southern territory and occupying cities like New Orleans and Memphis and Nashville doesn't seem to be working. So he moves toward what was called hard war, or even total war, rather than conciliation, by the policy of emancipation, by the policy of trying to destroy Confederate armies, and by 1864, the policy of destroying all kinds of Confederate economic resources in campaigns like Sheridan's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, Sherman's march through Georgia, and then through the Carolinas. The only way we're going to win this war is to completely destroy the ability of the Confederate states to wage war, destroy their property, destroy any property that can be used to wage war against the United States, and that includes slave property. So Union policy goes from or Union strategy, Union policy is always the same. But the national strategy and the military strategy evolve in a far more total and radical way during the course of the war. So the bottom line of that is that you've got this kind of progression in Union strategy from a limited war to an almost unlimited war. In the Confederacy, you've got this kind of ongoing tension between a defensive, strictly defensive military strategy and the kind of offensive defensive strategy that we identify with Robert E. Lee.
Why do you think that in his after-action reports, 2 of them, Lee did not mention as an objective of the Gettysburg campaign conquering a peace? And instead he listed all kinds of what I think a lot of people, yourself included, I gather, think were secondary reasons, such as, well, we'll get a bunch of cattle and so forth and feed ourselves, and the farmers in Virginia won't be raided for a change. Why do you think Lee did that, and does it say anything about Lee?
Well, I think he did that because in your after-action reports, you don't say we failed. Here was my purpose in invading Pennsylvania, and sorry, Mr. Davis, we failed. No, you say in your after-action report, here's what we did, and here's what we accomplished, and that's what we intended to accomplish. And you leave out. But we know from a lot of other evidence, Lee's letters to Davis before he invaded Pennsylvania, or while he was in the process of invading Pennsylvania, that our goal is to basically conquer a peace by defeating the Army of the Potomac, and maybe seizing Harrisburg, maybe Baltimore. There are plenty of hints in the correspondence, as opposed to the after-action report, that's what Lee's goals were. No, I think it's, I don't know whether this means that Lee was somehow dishonest, or it's a kind of natural tendency, I think, in after-action reports to emphasize the positive and kind of slide over the negative consequences of this. Interestingly enough, in August of 1864, Lee actually offered his resignation as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, because he had come under some criticism from Southern newspapers, not the Virginia newspapers, but mainly the Charleston newspapers. And there had been other sort of undercurrents of criticism for him having gone too far in the Gettysburg campaign, having failed. So I think, and he offered his resignation to Davis, saying, I can't really accomplish. I'm not the man who can accomplish the goals that you need to accomplish with this army anymore. And maybe it'd be better if I stepped down and you found somebody who could do it. Well, I think this was, Lee knew Davis wasn't going to accept that resignation. I think this was a kind of ploy to quiet that criticism. And Lee was a very smart man. This is the way, this is the way you try to function and get along, I think, in a relationship with your president and with your society.
It reminds me very humorously of George Aiken of Vermont's famous comment about how we could get out of the Vietnam War.
Declare victory and leave.
Declare victory and go home. Now, do we have any questions from the audience on this question of the match or mismatch between war aims and war methodologies? Sir?
Joe Cassidy, Portsmouth. We put a lot of emphasis on the fact that Lee set the strategy in the Eastern Theater. That it was he that fought the decisive battles. It was he that decided where those troops were going to be split up. I seem to remember at one point Davis asked him to split his army to give more defense to Vicksburg, and that Lee put the kibosh on that. Does he have that kind of authority if you take the capital and you move it to, say, a Mobile or a Montgomery?
Yeah, I see the implication. I see the point of your question. Probably not. On the other hand, Virginia was the largest state in the Confederacy. And Lee aside, a lot of the principal military officers in the Confederacy, including some of those who fought in the West, Joseph Johnston, for example, came from Virginia. So there would have been important strategic objectives in Virginia. Richmond, of course, was the major industrial center for the Confederacy as well. And that would have been true whether or not the capital was Richmond. So there still would have been a focus on Virginia. It would not have been as much of a focus on Virginia. I think you're probably right that Lee's influence over Confederate strategy, which, by the way, derived primarily from his success in those major campaigns, starting with the 7 Days, would have still been fairly strong, but probably not as strong as if the capital had not been in Richmond. I think that's a very interesting suggestion. I've always, on this issue, it's a little bit separate from your question, but this issue of where the Confederate capital should be and why Richmond, I've always asked people who raise that question, well, where do you think it ought to have been? New Orleans was the largest city. It, of course, was captured very early in the war, April 1862. I think the reason the Confederates put the capital in Richmond is because Virginia was so important to them and so important in symbolic as well as substantive sense. I mean, George Washington was from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson was from Virginia, the kind of great, the people that the Confederacy put on its great seal and on its coins and on its money were mostly Virginians. And the prestige of Virginia as having been the kind of foremost state in the South in the Revolution, where most of the founding fathers came from, that had a lot to do with the decision to put the capital in Richmond, I think. But I think you make an interesting suggestion about the way in which Confederate strategy, and especially Lee's influence on that strategy, might have been quite different if Richmond had not been the capital.
Nathan Piscini, Austin Prep School. To what extent do you think, you seem to suggest that Lincoln doesn't actually change his war aims, rather the way that he goes about his military strategy to achieve the war aims at the beginning of the war. Although it seems like reading his second inaugural, all as short as it was, it makes little mention at that point about reconciling North and South. Then it's all about slavery at that point. So I wondered if you could comment a little bit about to what extent do you think he actually altered his war aims to be more about ending slavery versus
Yeah, I'm
restoring
glad
it?
you raised that question because I should have actually gone into that when I was talking about this a few moments ago. I think it actually did. It's an interesting progression here. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and other actions against slavery in 1862 and 1863 are a part of what I call national strategy. That is to mobilize the slave population to help the North win the war. It's not yet policy, but it's national strategy. But it raises the issue, if you're going to use emancipation as a part of your effort to weaken the Confederacy by striking against its labor force, and strengthen your own side by mobilizing that population, not only as laborers, but of course, starting with late 1862 and 1863, as soldiers for your own side, yet you're still fighting a war to restore the Union of 1861, which was a union that had slavery, then there's a potential incongruity, incompatibility between your policy, restoration of the Union, and your strategy, mobilizing the slave population as free people. And that discrepancy, that incompatibility was obvious pretty clear to people, and that's why by 1863 and especially in 1864, the North is moving toward making the abolition of slavery a war aim, a matter of policy, not simply a matter of national strategy. And so when Lincoln runs for re-election in 1864, he runs for re-election on a platform that pledges a constitutional amendment to end slavery. And indeed, the Senate of the United States passes such a constitutional amendment by the requisite 2/3 majority in April of 1864. But because the Democrats had made gains in the 1862 congressional elections, the Republicans didn't have a two-thirds majority in the House, and they couldn't get the 13th Amendment through the House until much later, January 31st, 1865, when just enough Democrats either voted for it or abstained to get it through, after the outcome of the election of 1864 made it clear that this was going to happen. And you raise a good point, so that Northern policy does change. And you're quite right about the second inaugural. It's all about, you know, this war may go on until every drop of blood drawn by the lash over the last 250 years is equaled by the amount of blood drawn by the sword. And that God may have sent this war as a punishment for slavery, and now he's using this war to bring that sin of slavery to an end. That's clearly a radical difference from war aims in 1861, and it's a process that becomes part of the effort to maintain a kind of compatibility between policy and strategy.
Sir?
Hi, Ross McClintock from St. John's High School in Shrewsbury. George McClellan has come in for his fair share of criticism from historians. Among those criticisms is that he was out of step with the whole idea that politics is very important. If you're fighting a war in a democracy, that you need to take political opinion into consideration and understand these things. I'm wondering if Joe Johnston might be accused of the same thing, if maybe he didn't recognize the political realities or the cultural realities, and maybe that's why there was so much tension with his strategy.
Well, that's a very interesting suggestion. I think you're right. I've often said, and I'm not original about that Joe Johnston was the McClellan of the Confederacy, or McClellan was the Joe Johnston of the Union. And I have usually meant that in terms of their caution, their defensive mindedness, their lack of aggressive initiative seizing military leadership. But I think you're also right that both of them wanted to fight the war in a kind of military vacuum without regard to the political pressures that made it impossible for their respective commanders-in-chief, Lincoln and Davis, to fight the war without regard to public opinion and to the reality of politics. And that's a very interesting suggestion. I think you're absolutely right about that.
John Wood, I teach at the McDonough School in Owings Mills, Maryland, right outside Baltimore. Actually, bringing up the impact of the American Civil War in Europe kind of plays into my question of what impact events in Europe may have had on the decision of many people in the North to rewrite or join Southerners in rewriting the version of the Civil War. And I'm thinking particularly about the Paris Commune at that point. We've talked about the fact that Northerners wanted to see a reunification of the country, and I wanted to pose to you several possibilities that would explain that. I'm wondering if the rise of immigration in the 1890s, you spoke of Lincoln and Republicans emphasizing a system of equality. Well, by the time there's a push of the rise of immigration in the country, have Northerners reconsidered that idea of equality, and does burying African Americans once again justify burying the Jews and Italians and whatnot who are moving to the United States? And also a fear that opportunity for the working class has been taken too far. The fear of the Paris Commune was very real in the United States. In fact, one of your colleagues titled her book on the post-Reconstruction era, Standing at Armageddon. So is there possibly an explanation for Northern support for Southern racism in the version of the Civil War, perhaps? Is there an answer for that in Northerners wondering if this notion of equality perhaps has gone too far and has gotten out of hand for us as well?
Yeah, that definitely did happen, I think, in the 1870s and after. It wasn't only the Paris Commune, I think, but it was also events in the United States itself. The Molly Maguires in the Pennsylvania coal fields, the great railroad strike of 1877, the rise of a kind of anarchist, radical political ideology among some elements of the working class in the 1880s, the Haymarket bombing in 1886, the Pullman strike in 1894, the large-scale immigration from Eastern and Southern European countries that began in the 1880s and 90s. I think that a lot of people in the North of old Anglo-American background, upper class, having been committed to democracy and a republican form of government as the ideal form of government in the middle 19th century, now began, and having been committed to the ideal of equality, of equal rights, the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, began to have have second thoughts about this. Prominent journalists like Edwin L. Godkin, who was editor of The Nation, very influential. Prominent German journalists like George William Curtis, editor of Harper's Weekly, very strong radical and egalitarian in the 1860s, began to wonder if maybe democracy might go too far and social equality might go too far as the country was being torn apart by by conflicts between labor and capital and the strikes, by large-scale immigration. And they began to form more of a bond of sympathy with upper-class Southern whites who were saying, well, you know, we know how to manage our lower classes of a working class of a different ethnic background than we are. And maybe that's not such a bad idea. So you do get a kind of current of ideological congruence between some upper-class northern intellectuals, industrialists, political scientists, thinkers, philosophers in the later decades of the 19th century and saying, well, maybe democracy has its limitations, and that meant a greater degree of congruence and sympathy with upper-class Southern whites in their attempt to create a caste society. In other words, the emergence of a greater degree of class consciousness on the part of the upper class and in the lower classes, I think, in the North, created a greater bond of sympathy with the caste system that was emerging in the South at the same time as the successor to slavery. I think you've got your finger, and the Paris Commune did play a major role in that, but I think it was only part of a larger process, both domestic and foreign, that was going on in these later 19th century decades.
Jim, could I ask a follow-up question to that gentleman's? I take it from what you're saying that to a rather considerable extent, the increasing sympathy for the South is a reflection of the working conditions that obtained due to the Industrial Revolution starting after the Civil War, because that's what split, that's what caused the rise in radicalism, I understand. You want to comment on that?
Well, I think probably the biggest story in the United States in the last quarter of the 19th century was the rise of really large-scale industrial capitalism. Its roots go back, of course, before the Civil War. But this is the era of the creation of the trusts. This is the era of really violent conflicts between capital and labor. This is the era of Rockefeller and Carnegie and Vanderbilt and Harriman. And I think that the idea that the United States is this kind of egalitarian democratic society in which is largely rural, the world that Lincoln grew up in, where somebody born in a log cabin can rise to become president, or somebody like Andrew Carnegie, who was an immigrant from a very modest Scottish family, can rise to become an industrial magnate as he did. That's beginning to break down. and the creation of these huge concentrations of capital and the industrial conditions that obtained in steel mills and coal mines and the railroads and so on are creating a much different society than it existed in the 1840s and 1850s, and that's what kind of creates this sense of a greater class divisions in American society, which makes the North in some ways moving closer to the social conditions or the social order that existed in the South.
Len Rabinowitz, Ashland High School. I guess I'm getting ahead a little bit, but I have a question about the 13th Amendment. Two court cases. In the Plessy versus Ferguson case, one of the arguments that Plessy brought was that segregation was a violation of the 13th Amendment, which I'm sure we've all read it. It doesn't really say much. It's very, very short. And just last week I was researching the Boston school desegregation case in the 1970s under Garrity. And the Boston School Committee was also charged with violation of the 13th Amendment in segregating the school system. Now, the courts rejected that in both cases. Garrity rejected it, and obviously they did in Plessy versus Ferguson. But I've never been able to understand what was their reasoning for even trying to say that segregation was a violation of the anti-slavery amendment.
I'm not the expert on this, and I'm not sure I can give you an answer to that question, but in John Marshall Harlan's dissenting opinion in Plessy, and I think earlier in the civil rights cases of 1883, Harlan based his dissent on the 13th Amendment more even than the 14th Amendment, and his argument was that the 13th Amendment inherently made former slaves citizens with equal citizenship right. In other words, the only thing that had made slaves legally different from other Americans, from white Americans, was slavery. And the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and gave the former slaves an equal stake in society. And that any kind of legislation that treated them as a separate category was I'm trying to think of the phrase that Harlan used, but it was something like, what was the phrase he used?
Badges of slavery?
Badges of slavery, yes. That's right. Segregation is a badge of slavery, and therefore contrary to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Now, as you suggest, the courts usually have rejected that badges of slavery argument, but that's, I think, where it came from.
That's a very good question, because I never understood the phrase badges of slavery until some recent readings. And the reason I even knew of it was that it was a phrase constantly used in 14th Amendment civil rights cases in the 1960s, in voting rights cases. It came back into the public lexicon at that time. I never understood what it meant, but thank you. The man has explained it, and so what? Let me say thank you to all of you for coming. And Jim, I thank you very much.